Welcome back to the second segment of Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small. My co-host is Paul Ogden. We're here today with our guests, Mike Kole and Jeff Cox, to discuss the best, worst, and mediocre presidents of the United States. Our audience is here to listen to our show, and they're welcome here. Let's talk about mediocrity and a mediocre president. And I kind of surprised everybody, I guess, this morning by saying, well, let's talk about mediocre. I mean, are we talking about somebody who didn't do anything?
Yeah, I think you want to define mediocre first, because when people hear mediocre, they sometimes think bad, but it actually doesn't mean bad. It means average.
Or nothing.
Or nothing.
As a test, as a value, and by the way, we're at Big Hat Books, 6510 Cornell Avenue, Indianapolis. Excellent book selection here. They have on sale William Henry Harrison's biography. Also, World Book Night will be celebrated April 23rd, 2012. If you register online with worldbooknight.com, I think it is, you can, or worldbooknight.org, you can pick by February 1st, by February 15th, something like that, you can pick out the books that you want and come here and pick them up on April 26th. I think there has to be a sense, if you're looking at a mediocre president, if you just look at the name and think, huh?
Your book right there, Harrison. I mean, he gets an incomplete. He dies within weeks of giving, and let that be a lesson to you about speaking for 5 hours,
Yes.
traveling on and on in the rain.
However, I will point out that you don't get pneumonia from not wearing a coat outside. Pneumonia is
Hat.
Or hat.
Yeah,
You
but
don't get it.
he was in a
You don't get
swamp.
I still think it serves as a nice cautionary tale against 5-hour dissertations
Well, that's
at your inauguration.
I believe-
Who suffered more, William Henry Harrison or his listeners?
Well, and here's a question to ask then, does that mark him as having been a great president?
Like I said, I think he gets an
Let's go to Mike and
incomplete.
get his list.
Well, he gets an incomplete. Well, I didn't compile a list of
Oh.
mediocre. I mean,
I figured you could pick them out on the spot, right?
I mean, I guess you'd go with the names that you can't, that you go, oh, yeah, like you said, what were they done? You know, Polk. I couldn't even begin to tell you without reflecting on that. I mean,
Polk was responsible for invading Mexico. And Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in that war, said it was the most blatant land grab, unwarranted land grab that a country could engage in.
Well, you're talking like there's something wrong with that.
There is something wrong with our just kind of...
Not when we do it.
Paul? Mark, let me jump in and give some mediocre presidents. I've marked some off. Gentlemen,
Miller,
on a
Fillmore.
list ranking the presidents.
Fillmore routinely gets put at the bottom.
Yeah, and
Yeah, he does.
I'm
He's at
gonna.
the bottom. He just didn't do anything.
Well, let me give you some names. William Howard Taft, pretty mediocre president. Followed Teddy Roosevelt, and between Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson. William McKinley, who was on the cusp of the modern era and was replaced by Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, McKinley was killed in office.
Well, that's why he's mediocre. He couldn't get out of the way of the bullet.
Well, then I mean, that'd be William Henry Harrison, but you gave him an incomplete.
Yeah, but McKinley also was responsible for the Spanish-American War. And that was a blatant land grab of Puerto Rico, Cuba, Hawaii.
You talk like there's something wrong with that.
That's going to be a common theme, I think. James Madison, I have him listed. I read a book on Madison and Monroe, and basically Madison he did great work creating the Constitution, but in terms of being a president, wasn't that good. Local president, Benjamin Harrison, he was a weak wartime president. He was basically not there a lot of the time.
Didn't he help start the War of 1812 for no apparent reason?
No, kind of the British started the War of 1812 by grabbing our shipping. And then actually the Madison family left a very good meal sitting on the table at the White House when British troops came in. The food was still warm on their plates.
And ate it.
No, he did mishandle the war.
Benjamin Harrison, I mean, what did Benjamin Harrison do?
He sandwiched Grover Cleveland.
I want a picture.
Another mental image I did not need.
And let's go to someone we all maybe can remember, Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford.
Very average.
I believe...
I wouldn't put him as worst, but I would say
No!
very average.
That's the whole point. It's like Gerald Ford.
So that's my list of 5 or 6, Mark.
Okay.
Do you have 5 or 6?
I do. I would say Gerald Ford epitomizes mediocrity. I'd say also President Garfield who was only in office for a few months before he was assassinated, actually started to try to do things but didn't do anything. I'm conflicted on John F. Kennedy because overall I believe that his presidency was mediocre, but he saved us from a nuclear war. That really, Bay of Pigs was set up by Eisenhower, and Kennedy felt it was his obligation because we had everything set in motion.
That was his call.
I know that was his call, but
then you follow through with it. You don't just do it half-heartedly.
well, yeah, but when you're invading someplace called the Bay of Pigs, I mean, that's really not a good indication.
Fidel
to begin with.
Castro had it coming.
Well, no. Anyways, so I would say Ford. Whom did I say after that?
It's a Garfield.
Garfield. I'd say also that Van Buren was very mediocre. John Quincy Adams was mediocre, and coming more to date, I'd have to agree with you on Taft. I'd say that's his the greatest impression that he left in the White House was from his great weight, walking down the hallways and stressing the wood floors.
I think he was the first one to throw out a baseball. Or was that Grover Cleveland?
No. Taft was the person to whom we can credit the 7-inning stretch.
Oh.
Because he would stand at the end of the set. He did that one game. He stood to stretch, and since then, so that was a positive thing that he did. But those are all mediocre people.
I mean, for me, now that I think about it a little bit more too, I would put Carter in there actually. His reputation, it puts him normally at the bottom, but I think we'd already begun to discuss, when I talked about the economy, the president tends to take either more blame or more credit than is due. However, I would say this, I think Ronald Reagan got a lot of credit for things that Carter's administration actually did, such as the deregulation of the airlines. That was a glorious thing that made air travel more accessible to the average American and cheap, whereas it had been very expensive and very exclusive prior to that. It was the Carter administration that deregulated the airlines, and Reagan gets credit for it, and it's just inaccurate.
And Carter also cut the money supply, which caused a recession, but that was necessary to stop stagflation.
Right, and he doesn't get a whole lot of credit for that either, and Reagan gets the credit for the turnaround. That happens a couple years later. You had the Volcker recession in the meantime, but then after that, then the economy took off. But so Carter, I think, for better or for worse, tends to get judged on a couple of things that are stylistic and again have to do with conflict. He's judged rightly on Iran, very poorly, but he's also, what was the name of the speech where he wore the sweater?
Malaise.
The Malaise speech. And I disagree with him on that speech, but I think those things left such a lasting impression as to really downgrade, and it overrides the whole. I think he was mediocre.
What about Jeff? Do you have any comment on mediocre?
Well, I think Carter was one of the worst presidents that our country's ever had. In terms of mediocre, I tend to see it more as adequacy, something, and you just don't do anything in office. Now, some people call that a good thing. But when you're the president, you should have some way of improving the country. And some people just did nothing. And I think Millard Fillmore sort of epitomizes that. I mean, he's not remembered for anything except for having a really weird name. Eisenhower.
Fillmore was the last of the Whigs.
Eisenhower, I think, is very overrated. I think he had a defense policy that I believe was extremely limited and short-sighted. In terms of he wanted nuclear weapons and nothing else. He was for more bang for the buck. And it's like, if your only options are to nuke someone or nothing, you're going to have some issues at that point. I tend to agree on Gerald Ford. Now, Ford came in at a bad time. He wasn't elected, but he was sort of a nothing. Beyond that, I tend to agree on John Quincy Adams.
Going back to Fillmore for just a moment, he became very unpopular during his presidency because of his enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. And also, he undermined the Missouri Compromise to a great deal, or signed it into law. But he was doing things that were, especially like on the Fugitive Slave Act, it wasn't that he did nothing. Although he did start the Know Nothing Party, which for somebody to start a party that emphasizes not knowing stuff, I wouldn't want to have that person in office. But
Well, it's better than advocating a party that thinks it knows everything, and advertises it knows everything, but actually knows nothing.
which is both major parties.
Yeah.
I'm good with that assessment. I'm good with that.
I think the last one I put under mediocre would probably be U.S. Grant.
Oh, see, that's an interesting point. What do you look at in Grant, because his was one of the most corrupt administrations, although he was not corrupt himself. I don't believe anybody would legitimately claim that he was corrupt.
And Grant's reputation has been rehabilitated probably in the last 20, 25 years. He was thought of as a drunk, and his administration was very corrupt. But he did press through the 15th Amendment. And looking back later,
And tell our viewers
the
what
15th Amendment gave the rights of African Americans to vote, regardless, and I forget the exact language of the 15th Amendment, but regardless of previous servitude or the language that had to address the slave, whether a person was
descended from
slaves or not. So that gave the right to vote to black Americans and to free slaves. That, in its time, was a pretty remarkable thing. And he gets much more credit now than he did, say, 25, 30 years ago.
He also was the president during the time period depicted in the Wild Wild West, arguably one of the best television series in United States history. But then he really didn't do anything as president in that series except give James West and Artemis Gordon a really cool train and a whole bunch of really neat weapons and stuff like that. So that was kind of an aspect of his presidency that he knew nothing about, that there would be a fictional thing arise from his time in office.
And unfortunately, the movie Wild Wild West fell far short of the series.
It sucked, and apparently Will Smith has rented a house, by the way, because the Super Bowl's here tomorrow. Super Bowl, trademark, registered.
The large game.
The large contest. He rented a house in Zionsville to like party all weekend, and I thought, talk about mediocrity. Okay, a mediocre actor has tons of money to rent out a house in one of the more fashionable suburbs of Indianapolis to party all weekend, and it's like, I wonder if he was on that Gulfstream 4 that flew over my head day before yesterday when we were walking over to BRT. So our 5, we've had some overlap on the 5 mediocre, and so we can look at, there's a degree of mediocrity to every presidency maybe, because there are stretches where they don't do anything. I mean, and maybe in some instances it's good that some of those presidents don't do anything.
I think we also have to understand they don't have absolute power. You got Congress to deal with. And a lot of times Congress might be of the other party.
But that then is getting to a question of during times of war whether they can declare power that they really didn't have.
And I think the other thing is the scope of the presidency. The presidential powers have changed significantly, increased. If you look back at Lincoln, he spent almost his first year in office simply interviewing job seekers. If you can imagine the President of the United States interviewing people who wanted civil service jobs, and to spend almost a year until Stanton comes in and says, this is kind of beneath you. You really should get on to some other important things.
And he had to sneak into town for his inauguration and in disguise. This is the end of our second segment. We'll be back in just